In the words of Samuel L. Jackson from Jurassic Park, hold on to your butts, because now we have finally got to the video where I get to talk about the homunculi, and I am so excited about this. This is going to be the best video by far. The reason why it takes so long to get into the homunculi in Sacred Star, which incidentally is also the reason for the first criticism, in that people miss the hidden depth that is contained within this film, is that the homunculi are symbolically present in the film, not literally present. And in order to understand this symbolism, you have to be versed in the entire land of Milos. As this is a new realm for the Fullmetal Alchemist world, a lot of Fullmetal Alchemist fans did not give Creta, Milos, and the Amestrian border the time of day, or allow it and the writers who have created this world the opportunity to flesh out their original contributions to Arakawa's manga. This is an unfortunate mentality, and I see it a lot in the fan community, that by default, de facto, any side story films that are produced for a major series are off point. They're fundamentally behind the 8 ball in the eyes of fans, because it's not continuing the story, it's a cash cow, it's a cheap spin-off. Pick your reason to hate it. Everyone always does. And very rarely do these films get the respect that they deserve in their own right, because their affiliation with a huge franchise like Fullmetal Alchemist oftentimes will overshadow any artistic merit that the directors, the writers, and the animators produce for their contributions to the world. This is exactly what has happened with Sacred Star of Milos, with the land of Milos and the Sacred Plateau, and with this new third original take on the homunculi for the Fullmetal Alchemist world. Now that I've taken the time to show you that the Sacred Plateau is a rock bell, that the valley surrounding the Sacred Plateau is actually akin to the Ishvalan's suffering, and specifically Scar. And a point that I forgot to mention in some of the last videos is that if you actually look at the map that Roy Mustang is gazing at when he is learning about Milos, you'll see that the rivers surrounding Milos actually look like Scar's face, and you can even see the X-shaped scar. It's a profile shot, so you have to be aware, but it's very clear, like, you know, like this, that it is Scar's profile with his scar on his head, with Milos contained inside his mouth, as if he's biting down on it. Excuse me. This makes sense from the perspective of Mustang viewing it, because the city is essentially a pocket watch. Don't forget 311, as we have discussed in previous videos. And by proxy, its likeness in the Rock Crusher also. So you have Scar chomping down on a State Alchemist pocket watch and digesting it or swallowing it, making perfect sense, because Star's character, for a good chunk of the series, is a serial killer that walks around, that roams the land, and takes the lives of State Alchemists who he deems to be in need of some wrath, some divine wrath, for their sins in the Ishvalan War. And in light of that Sacred Plateau being a rock bell, the scar surrounding the rock bell being in the likeness of Scar, and actually the map showing his face, also the sky, if you look in the scene where the rock bell is first revealed and you have that long panning shot, if you look at the setting sun, it's actually setting into the mouth, into a silhouette of mountains that actually looks like a nose, and then going back to a mouth. And that silhouette is also in the profile of Scar from the map that Mustang was looking at. So if that wasn't clear enough, you have the setting sun, which is a universal literary motif for death, the land of the West, the setting sun, and the death of human life, setting on the profile of Scar, overlooking the scarred land of the Ishvalans, with the rock bell actually hanging as an earring from Scar, which I can bring up now since I've done that whole video on the earring. the burden of Scar killing the rock bells. You know what I mean? And with that environment being forged, not only that, but the city being demonstrated to be Alphonse, and the valley's decomposed portions combined with the Crichton excavation equipment being Edward. And linking that likeness to the actual sacred mountain, which is the original for the shape of the city and the source of the fire or the soul, the Firebird, that represents the spirit of Fullmetal Alchemist, which at the end of the movie pours forth out of the mountain into the valley in the shape of a book, and literally, just like in the biblical narrative, portrays the writing on the wall that spells the end for the Crichton dominance and the slothful provincial government of the Amestrians run by Soyuz. And does so in a circular valley where a serpent of water, an Ouroboros of water, is then consumed by an Ouroboros of fire coming out of the mountain, fire and water, and this snake devours its own tail as the elements combine, the plot points combine, the world of Fullmetal Alchemists combines into one, and all becomes one and one becomes all. This is the stage necessary to discuss the homunculi. And until you get the big picture, the land, until you're a master of the lay of the land and you understand the geography and the symbolic connotations of the architecture, we can't talk about the homunculi because it would come off as cheap or shallow. If I were to do that, you would say you are reading into this movie things that aren't there, that you wish were there but that aren't there. But I think because of the foundation that I've laid with the past 3 videos, even if you don't agree with my conclusions or the direction that I'm taking these retrospectives, you have to acknowledge that visually, very strikingly, these pieces of this puzzle are present. I am simply trying to interpret them because of my, my love for Fullmetal Alchemist and my fairly in-depth knowledge of the series. I've been a fan for almost 9 years and pretty obsessively combed through the original anime and the manga. Not so much Brotherhood because it doesn't really float my boat, but I have watched Brotherhood twice all the way through to give it its fair shake, and there were parts that I really liked. And I've taken all of that back around and incorporated it back into this movie because I have a real passion for anything FMA. And whenever something new comes out, I am excited to discuss. And what I find, unfortunately, is that as a result of this first criticism and the attitude underlying why this is a criticism concerning the interconnectedness or lack thereof of Sacred Star and the homunculi as villains, it's really deadened the fan reaction to this film. And it's made me sad because, it's a hobby of mine and I really like to talk about it with other fans because I find it to be a very deep and meaningful universe that has strong resonance with the real world. And to see this written off as a worthless spin-off, you might think this is melodramatic, but it really does break my heart. It makes me very sad. Not only because I love Fullmetal Alchemist, but also because it's not true, and because this movie is actually quite to the contrary, an incredible piece of the Fullmetal Alchemist universe, and an amazing. I mean, we never got to see the West, in the manga or the anime in any great detail, and this is like to have all of that cool stuff hiding out over in the West, is so cool. It just makes everything that much better and lets you relive FMA all over again. That's what I hope to do, because that's the message of this film, that Book of the Ouroboros that contains Fullmetal Alchemist. And now that you have a grip on the world and how it kind of ebbs and flows, we're going to get into the homunculi. And we're going to access this very dense topic through the figure of the Fisher King, which I brought up at the end of the 3rd video. Or, to translate that into FMA terms, father. There's one caveat, though. You need to keep in mind something that you may or may not know, depending on your upbringing and your religious preference, if any. And that is the notion of the old man and the new man. It's latent in many religions because a lot of, well, or maybe I should say in spirituality, because a big component of spirituality from many different disciplines is the refinement of one's inner self, the perfection of a being. You know, the alchemists see it as refining the philosopher's stone. And they use chemicals as metaphors for physical objects and spiritual realities to them. That by viewing, this is according to Jung's analysis of alchemical texts, by the way, so I'm not just pulling this out of the air. But according to Jung's like 40-year study on alchemical texts and alchemical discipline, what was going on in the alchemist lab was a mind, a psychological process whereby objects, physical objects, were identified through the mind to parts of the human subconscious or desires that a human may have, and that by viewing them as they metamorphosed from one substance into another substance in these, you know, pre-chemistry, pre-scientific method labs, viewing them, we then learn more about ourselves and the fundamental nature of reality, and then are transformed. In Christianity, this is encompassed in the notion of putting to death what is old, putting to death the old man, and bringing forth the new man. This is couched in the terms of the old man being the man of sin, the fallen man, and the new man being the man clothed in Christ's redemption or in, you know, the blood, and enlivened by the Holy Spirit. You need to be aware of that concept. And you also need to be aware of its connection to the phoenix as a two-headed bird. A lot of times people just think of the phoenix as a firebird, but if you penetrate into the phoenix mythology to any great depth, you're going to find one of two variants of the double-headed bird. The first is that there's actually two birds. One is an old bird, one is a new bird, and the old bird comes to Heliopolis, the city of the sun, where it immolates itself, and then the new bird is born from within the old bird, carrying on its legacy. This occurs on a 500-year cycle, and is hence a perfect fit for the snake that devours its own tail, the cyclical nature of, you know, the reality of the universe. But the other variant is actually a two-headed bird. All right, and whichever one that you choose to picture in your mind while we have these discussions, you need to equate the concept of old man and new man with Phoenix Head 1 and Phoenix Head 2, because that's what you're going to see visualized in Sacred Star, where Lieutenant Atlas is wearing Ashleigh Crichton's old face, but then Ashleigh Crichton himself is actually the man whose face has been ripped off, and this confrontation occurs where Ashleigh Crichton like reclaims his face and reabsorbs it into himself and then kills Atlas. And that right there in a nutshell is the Phoenix, putting to death the flesh, so to speak, destroying his own face to free his spirit from the horrible, dark, and disturbing memories affiliated with the loss of his face when Atlas robbed him and his parents of their research notes and set the whole plot in motion. As long as you keep that in mind, we will be able to have a pretty fruitful discussion, because this discussion is going to revolve around the character of the Fisher King, which is Ashleigh. And Ashleigh Atlas is the chief duality of this film, from the perspective of the new characters. Having said all that, we're going to dive in, and we're going to take the advice of the Grail legends and ask the question, who are you, Fisher King, or what caused thee to be wounded, O Fisher King? And we're going to use that as our jumping off point. If you look at Ashleigh Crichton when he's first revealed in the tower, and you pay attention to the way that the mask, his profile, is shaded from the side, you're going to notice that he has his nose as reconstructed by the mask, but then he has a little shadow in here, a little piece of shading. If you look at that shadow, and in your mind you realize that that is the actual nose of Ashleigh Crichton's childlike face, because it's drawn differently than his adult face, obviously, you'll see there's actually a face within a face. So, in other words, the mask is the flask. Very literally, because there's a glass partition and a breathing apparatus. The purpose of the mask being presumably to prevent Ashleigh Crichton from being infected, because he has no skin on his face, you know what I mean? And also to hide his deformity. That is Dwarf in the Flask. The little boy, Ashleigh, the memory symbolized by the shadow. You know, he was a shadow of his former self. The memory of the boy inside of the flask, Dwarf in the Flask Homunculus, which manga fans know to be the ultimate description of the villain of the series, Dwarf in the Flask Homunculus. Some further details that need to be observed about our father, our Dwarf in the Flask here. Coming from his eye, I think it's actually, his right eye, there is a little bit of reflection that very clearly takes on the form of a tear. At the top of the tear, you actually notice that the way that it pools around the recess of the orb in the eye socket is of a wolf, and then weeping down. And if you look from the side, he has this golden gilt cheekbone that descends down below the level of the screen. Now, it doesn't actually connect, but if you just look at it for a second, what that actually looks like is a fishhook. It goes down, and then it comes back up, like that. And that is your signature for the Fisher King. Also, though, the dog in the military, right? Because he's weeping a tear in the shape of a wolf or a dog, obviously, because he's perpetually sorrowful, the man of sorrows over what happened to him and what he was forced into becoming. And you have this very convenient linking thereby of the dog in the military and the Fisher King, but more relevant to our discussion, to the notion of the old man and the new man, the phoenix and the dwarf in the flask. Because the shadow at the back of his face mirrors the scar on Atlas's face, you know, where he's like covered it up with Ashleigh's face, and there's like this nasty scar back there. So that scar back there is like the old man, okay? And then if you look at the way that the hook comes out, it's actually hooked in then to the new face, or really what it is the invisible face of his childlike self that has been lost. The old man and the new man, the trauma caused by Atlas and the memory of his life before the fall, so to speak, or his life before the defacement. And that's key. That moment where he first opens his eye is supposed to be an enlightening moment. Now, if you're just watching through the movie without paying very close attention, it won't seem much of anything. But if you've been tracking the symbols from the beginning of the film until then, that is an epiphany moment. And in honor of that, the inside of his eye, because if you think about it, his eyes are actually the only thing left of his original face, like his actual flesh, you know what I mean? The outer partition. The socket around his eye is actually drawn through all of its scarring in the shape of Julia's little earring design with the little dot in the middle and these like very unique ray patterns that come off. Just take that and rotate it sideways and then put it over his eye, and there you go, it's the earring. So you can, you know, play all the word games you want with that. A piercing intellect allows you to recognize it, his piercing gaze. But none of that is really necessary as long as you understand the purpose of why it's drawn like that, which is an identification of the true brother and the sacred star, right? The one who controls the sacred star, which, as you see when you go underneath the city, is split into 7 lights, which encircle the city in the shape of a crescent moon, in the shape and likeness of the Ouroboros, reflecting the 7 sins or the 7 homunculi. And the master is the one who sees the eye, I guess you could say like the eye of the beholder, you know, the one who perceives and shapes destiny or shapes the world through his eye and his will, his desire, right? It's a blood-stained stone born of desire, I think Ed says in this movie. Very apropos for what we're discussing. With those images in mind, I'm going to take you back to the very first time we see Ashleigh, which is the first flashback in previous discussions identified as the truth or the cruelty of the world. And we're going to relate that scene, which is the last time you see him before he's defaced, and the scene we're currently discussing, which is the first time you see him after he's been defaced. And I'm going to show you a fundamental connection using the concept of the shadow of death, by which I mean to imply the mortality of man. Our inevitable limited lifespan and the sorrows and anguish that comes from that. Alright. First time we see Ashleigh Crichton, he's reading the book, he's talking to his sister. We've gone through the Ouroboros on the cover and the pyramid or the three-pointed triangle, which is the 3, and the serpent's head and tail, which cross as the 2 different ones coming together, or the 11. But I'm also going to point out now that as Ashleigh Crichton turns the page, you'll see this interesting optical illusion that when he brings his hand to rest on the edge of the page, it actually looks as though he's holding a flask. This is actually like a lantern that he's reading by. And that the light goes down into the flask in the shape of a fishing hook, which has the light at its core as like bait on the hook, I guess, if you want to say. And that as he's turning the book, learning truth, he's capturing the light, capturing the knowledge, okay? And that light is actually emanating out of the flask onto his collarbone and his face in such a way that it actually forms a little fish's mouth here, with his necklace framing it, and then there's actually, I think, like on this side, like a little dot, like where the fish's eye would be, so that his neck and head are actually coming out of the fish's mouth. This is a very clear indicator that Ashleigh Crichton is the Fisher King. Linking him to Quetzalcoatl and the whole Osiris, Horus, Isis, dying god, resurrecting god complex from Egypt, and its counterpart Quetzalcoatl in South America. Also, I think, was Adonai in Greek mystery religion? I'm a little hazy on that. But that whole mythological complex of characters upon which Christianity draws its resonance, or drew its resonance with the early 1st and 2nd century peoples. That's one of the reasons why Christianity was able to spread so quickly, in addition to, Koine Greek and the Roman Empire providing the roads and the means for Latin and Greek to transmit the message, was also the extraordinary similarity of the Christian message with several thousand years of, quote, pagan beliefs. That just allowed them to basically jump from one ship to the next and just rename all their deities as the in the Christian conception, and have a successful, pain-free conversion, in theory. So you make this connection through the fishhook, through knowledge, through the dwarf and the flask. You see how everything's like being tied together from the very beginning, actually very well conceived, whether intentionally or through artistic inspiration in certain scenes. Nothing is out of place, which actually makes interpretation very easy, because once you kind of know where to look, the things are always there. They never disappoint you. The symbols will always be in their proper place. And that's why I'm giving you the symbolic context, right? Just like I gave you the geographic, physical context for the Valley of Milos, so that you could get the homunculi. Now, in order to discuss the homunculi, I'm having to give you the symbolic context. Just think of it as a map, geography of symbols, and show you like what symbols are always next to what other symbols, in order to proceed deeper into the labyrinth, right? Deeper into the depths of the rabbit hole, to attain understanding of the brilliance of this film, the surprising brilliance of this film. When you lay all of these legends over, what you end up with is a Quetzalcoatl type of the faithful youth who studies at the feet of the masters, learns the ancient ways, and is in preparation to step up as his role, in his role as God, much like Christ studied the law and the prophets in the temple and was a master debater and expositor, exegeter of the law before he began his ministry. This is kind of the the training period, the initiatory period. And we see this is kind of cut short because Atlas breaks in and rips Ashleigh's face off. Now, last you see of poor Ashleigh Crichton is this shadow, this specter rising up out of his parents' laboratory from amidst the blood of the books, right? Which is actually a reflection where his parents are actually falling up, holding lanterns that kind of look very much like pitchforks that are actually impaling themselves, hanging down. So you could conceive of this as much like a mouth, as we discussed with the symbolism of Table City, but like in miniature. And if you look at the shape of the blood, this circular shape, and then the shadows cast by the lanterns, it's actually in the shape of an alchemist's flask. All right? So this is like the dark light or the dark fire, you know, the evil in mystical, Gnostic, kind of Kabbalistic, mystery religion stuff. They call them the Lords of the Dark Face, right? Sure, the Illuminati, you know what I mean? They want to achieve power, and with the light that they attain, snuff out the light for everyone else. And so this is the last we see of him, the darkness of the shadow of the homunculus rising up out of the alchemical laboratory, this dark shadow, to destroy him. The next time we see him, his face is gone, and what has replaced it is the very shadow that was cast over him the last time we saw him, which is now all that remains of his youthful demeanor, which is contained inside of the flask of the creature, the monster, that rose up, which is described, you know, in Atlas's Lies as a wolf chimera or a dog. The dog of the military, which is why he's weeping the dog tear. And I might as well bring up at this point Sirius, which is very prominent in mythology as the dog star. And at least in the Egyptian tradition represents, you know, Isis, who descends into the underworld and then reemerges. This is something that you will understand if you get that Sirius is unique in the night sky as being the only star that has a regular heliacal rising with the sun. Meaning pretty much on the same yearly cycle that the sun goes through, you know, as it resets and cycles through the calendar, Sirius goes through. So that, you know, at certain times it will actually rise at the same time that the sun rises. Which leads to some interesting dynamics, because this is one of the only stars in the night sky that actually progresses and moves, like, substantially, because of the, you know, the retrograde motion and like the spinning of the Earth and the tilting of the axis and stuff. It creates the illusion of motion for this star, such that for about 70 days of every year, from the perspective of Giza, you know, and the pyramids and the Egyptians, Sirius is gone. She goes below the horizon, or in effect descends into the underworld, right, only to reemerge. And this is analogous to the whole Christ descending into hell and ministering to the saints, you know, incarnating on the earth to save his church, you know, which is always described in like the terms of the bride. And this goes all the way back to Sumero-Babylonian mythology, all the way back to Ur of the Chaldees or the Chaldees, with, you know, Inanna, and also in the Greeks like Orpheus, you know, and his bride, and Izanagi and Izanagi in Japan. It's like a world archetype, you know, motif thing. So by aligning Dog the Military with Shadow of Death, with Dog Star, and the descent, disappearance, and reappearance, you can see very clearly that these resonances are being established to identify this character as something more than just a man in a mask. Or something a little bit more than, you know, the Crichton commander, who the film tries to make you believe, because the mask looks very similar to the commanding officer from the beginning of the film that brings the Professor Crichton and his family into the safety under the protection of the Crichton military. It begins to suggest that this individual is quite more than at first meets the eye. And this is demonstrated by the symbolic complex on his face and reinforced in the next shot, because the very next thing that you see is the gauges that Ashleigh Crichton is gazing into that have maps of the city. One is like a close-up of just the city, and then the other one is a far shot of the valley and the river and the Crichton side, you know, like the big picture of the valley. And what I want to point out to you, that those two circles, which looks very much like eyes, and specifically the way that the circle to Ashleigh's right and the viewer's right, it actually looks like the Führer's eye. Because the valley, you can see, is in the shape of the dragon, and then it spirals into, like, the eye. So this is actually the tattoo on the Führer's eye. And we got into, in the previous video, how that command post actually stands for, like, the Führer or the commander's position. And you can see, you know, the resonances begin for getting into, like, the 7 sins right there, because he's looking into this device that actually has, like, the Führer's eye, the all-seeing eye, the ability to see all. Which is kind of funny because, you know, what was Pride's little, FMA1 Pride's little bloviation at the end there? Like, I can see wind currents. You know, it was just a made-up thing that Bones threw in at the end. But his power was, like, seeing wind currents, and he predicted that Mustang would, like, sneak into his wine cellar because the wind was changed. You know, some ridiculous thing that was kind of silly. But that's actually what this is, because in the opening lyrics, it equates Ashleigh and Julie's relationship to the wind. And, you know, the things that you see and the things that I see are definitely the same. So the wind tells me as it caresses my cheek, whatever, you know. So this is actually like the wind caressing his cheek, because he's, like, looking into the spiraling tempest or maelstrom of where the Philosopher's Stone is created in the city, in the image of the eye of the FMA1 Fear Pride, right? Which, coincidentally, is also the boy-child that lurks in the shadows. So FMA1 Pride and FMA2 Pride, which through a crossing of the manga is actually technically father and son, right? So this is where, you know, this gets kind of mind-blowing, because it's actually father and son, that the whole notion of, like, Christ being the incarnation of the Father, and how does that work? Is he his mind? Is Christ like a robot, you know, that walks around? And that's actually kind of the, hilariously enough, that's actually the image, pretty awesome, really, of what's going on. It's like God the Father is, like, piloting a robot, you know, he's Ashleigh Crichton, and then the robot is, like, the command center of the device, which I'll get to in a second, is actually in the shape of Alphonse's armor, with him in the middle. You know that joke where, like, Alphonse, people call Alphonse a robot, right? So, yeah, you've actually got, like, God the Father piloting his robot Christ, you know, to, like, interact with the world, and it's like a giant robo, you know, genre or something. I don't think that was intentional, but it's hilarious because that's what it is if you just think about it for a couple minutes. I won't digress too far into that, because I was, believe it or not, I was making a point. And the point that I was making is that those eyes are identical to the transmutation circles from the book at the beginning of the film, right? Because he opens up to the page, and that's where he, you know, understands the carnal knowledge of the 2 transmutation circles, and then immediately his parents die, right? You know, so the moment thou eatest of the tree, thou shalt surely die, okay? And so what you have is an exact identical figure. It looks like it's different, but really it's just the same old boy staring at the book, studying the circles. You know what I mean? Even his face is preserved, except this time he's the dwarf in the flask. He has become sin. You know what I mean? Witnessed sin and become sin, and now he is, you know, in the process of redeeming Milos and himself through fire, catharsis. And if you notice the first close-up of that, you've got these 2 gauges with everything in them, but the way that they're shown, they're crossed together just like the figure 8 of the Ouroboros, the crossing of the Ouroboros on the book, on the cover of Professor Crichton's book. And to either side of this figure 8 pattern, there are 3 gauges. Okay? What is that? That is 311 and 311, because the cross, I already told you, represents the 11. We established that the flowing energy, the snake devouring itself, the 2 distinct ones, and yet the 1 combined. And then the 3 gauges on each side are the separate 3s. Very appropriate, because the 1 is just the city, and the other is the city in the valley. And as you now know from our previous discussion, the city represents the truth of Atlas, but the valley represents the true nature of the city, or the love that lies within the cruelty. So from the very first time you see Ashleigh Crichton, in the beginning in the flashback, but also, like, confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt when you see him after he's been defaced, you have the whole plot of the movie spelled out for you on these 2 circles. And now it's time for the mind. You know, now it's time for me to blow your mind, because the circle on the left, if you notice the spiral, it's like a little, it's like a little bit wider, and it's got the train track running down into it. If you look at that, it's actually an alpha, okay? The Greek alpha symbol, like alpha omega. So maybe you can see where this is going. And the circle on the right is actually drawn, the valley, one, is drawn like a flask, okay? Like a Grecian funeral urn, if you will, because I used the funeral urn analogy for the truth within the truth. So we're going to stick with the funeral urn analogy because it actually looks like a vase or a urn that the Greeks used to cremate their warriors in. And that is actually in the shape of omega. So the whole movie is spelled out within the contents of the book, right? But then literally the left circle is an alpha and the right circle is an omega. With the railroad tracks being the thing that create the alpha, right? So they came to Milos on the train. So this represents the beginning of the story. And the end of the story is Milos inside of the valley, which is the book with the Ouroboros, which represents a knowledge, like I discussed, of the lay of the land, becoming a master. So Omega, you have achieved the Omega weapon. You know what I mean? If you're into Final Fantasy, you have achieved knowledge of the world. You came into the world innocent, you fell, and you achieved knowledge. And through achieving knowledge, you came to understand the plan whereby all will be unified once again. Not the left eye or the right eye, but the third eye and the forehead, which represents, you know, fundamental primordial unity and understanding of your place. You know, beyond good and evil. I'll give Nietzsche a little shout out there. So you see that truth within truth represented within the spiral and the Fuhrer's eye, the master of the lay of the land, the reader of the wind. And it zooms out so that you see the things pulled apart, because that's the chief tension of the story, right? Is the one circle, Ashleigh, cruelly pulled away, and the other circle, Julia, love, which reunites. And as it's pulled away, you get a wide shot of Ashleigh Crichton's little, you know, base, with him looking down on his subordinates. And where his subordinates are standing are actually in the shape of a jaw. You can see it's like like you have to picture, you have to know what to look for, but picture being inside a mouth, on the tongue, all right? And looking down into the mouth such that you see, you know, the inside of the teeth and the jawbone. With that in mind, you will very easily perceive that he is actually inside of jawbone. Okay, so you say, what jawbone? Well, that question is answered almost immediately because Ashleigh Crichton says, send out some more chimera. We found them. Okay, or I found you, Mitsketa. Which is funny because he's looking at the truth within the truth, right? He says, Mitsketa, I found you. And that really, in a nutshell, is Fullmetal Alchemist, right? Ed searching and Al searching for the truth that lies within truth. This is why I say that this is a brilliant film, you know what I mean? It's like every scene of this film is laden, pregnant with meaning for people who love Fullmetal Alchemist in a fresh, new, exciting way. Which, ironically and unfortunately, is the reason why so people missed it. So many people missed it. Because it's so fresh and new that they don't even understand what they're looking at. Hence all of these absurdly long videos that I'm making to try to remedy that. But when he sends the chimeras out, what you'll actually see is that the command center is in the shape of Alphonse Elric. They show this shot of like the part where he's residing in, and it looks very clearly like Alphonse Elric's helmet. All right? And then his breastplate sticking out, which is like the place where the little chimeras jump out of. All right? And then on either side, he actually has the shoulders, just blades, that Alphonse literally has on his armor, those rounded wheels with the spikes that come off of them. Yeah, those are, there's like a tower on one side and a ladder on the other side or something like that, if I remember correctly. So, you know, that's where I get the, he's piloting Alphonse, you know what I mean? But really all you need to take from that is he's the spirit of Alphonse. And those circles are the blood seal, which is exactly what they are at the end of the movie when they activate them in the city. This is just like a foreshadowing of things to come, you know what I mean, for those who are in the know. And so he is represented as Alphonse's soul in the armor. And this is reinforced at the end of that scene, because that's when it cuts back and you see the valley for the first time from the perspective of Ashleigh's command center. And that is the cool visual paradox that we discussed last time, where like literally his face is here, and then it wraps around up to the mountain, and then it wraps back around. So that literally Ashleigh Crichton's command center is the mountain, and he's coming up out of the mountain. Much like, his neck and head came up out of the fish's mouth, his collarbone, when he was a young boy. Well, now, he's no longer just a child, right? Now, he commands the power of the mountain itself. So he is the Fisher King. He's like, within himself, so to speak, fighting on his own turf. And that is what lays out the Ouroboros parroting onto everything that we're discussing. Because that serpent that devours its own tail is overlaid on the mask of Ashleigh Crichton, which contains all the symbols that I've just spent the last 20 minutes or so discussing. And that brings everything around full circle to clue you in that this guy is the guy that controls the fire of the mountain, which is the soul of Fullmetal Alchemist. And his journey and his struggle are nothing more or less than the journey and struggle of all the characters for Fullmetal Alchemist, hence Father, and his enemy, Atlas, or the world, much like, Hohenheim in the Fullmetal Alchemist manga. Trying to think where I want to go from here. I think I'm going to stop there, because we're at the threshold of delving into the other 7 sins, and I've laid out in pretty exhaustive detail the symbols of the mask and the Fisher King and Father, and identifying Ashleigh Crichton, both his person and his destiny, with Father. And I'll pick up with the other 7 in the next video, because this is kind of like the big kahuna. I know there was something else. Oh, yeah. Last but not least, when the wolf chimeras go down the side of the mountain, they trace out the symbol of the infinity sign. And as they scurry over the breastplate where the arm would be, it's drawn in the shape of a chameleon. So this rotating power, which represents, the 11, the energy of the circles, overlaid on this chameleon represents, a shapeshifter. And the shape of Alphonse's armor is a castle. This is shown earlier. It looks very much like a redoubt on one of those like Cinderella fairy tale type castles. So this redoubt with the rotating power and the invisibility is an archetype of the Fisher King's castle, or actually, excuse me, more specifically, the Grail castle from mythology, that is constantly rotating and morphing and changing, and which hides the secrets to the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail has been demonstrated by many people to be identical with the Philosopher's Stone. In Wolfram's Parsival, the connotation, the alchemical connotations of the Philosopher's Stone and the Grail are drawn out. And this is actually the point I wanted to conclude on, because this represents Father's castle. And the geothermal plant, the underground castle, remember, right? Because though he is above the ground, he controls the power below the ground. Okay, so this is the duality of like central and then beneath central. And this is reinforced by the geothermal plane itself, which is nothing less than Father's Cauldron from the FMA manga. It's drawn in the identical shape. It's just in a different place, so you might not be expecting that. But these are the signs and the seals and the symbols that equate Ashleigh Crichton with Father. The origin of the 7 sins, as you'll know from FMA. In FMA 1, it was Dante, and she drew these sins from... She didn't make all the 7 sins. I think she made like 3. Pride, gluttony, and greed, and then along with Hohenheim, envy as well. But in FMA manga, Father purges himself of his sins, so to speak, creates identities out of them, and then uses them as his like minions to control. And this is exactly what we're going to see happen in FMA Sacred Star of Milos with Ashleigh Crichton. But in order to understand that, you've got to understand Father himself. And that's what we've accomplished in this video. I appreciate you bearing with me. There's a lot of information to get through. But now that we've got that piece on the board, we can really get into the 7 sins and their unique identities in and around the valley. So I hope to see you back in part 5. All right.